So when I first started in emergency management, one of the things that was made abundantly clear quite quickly is that we couldn't talk about achieving emergency management outcomes without also talking about the contributions of faith-based and community-based organizations. Now, every emergency management in here knows that their presence is invaluable because they're meeting the gaps and needs that we often are unable to fulfill from the government side. Their generosity is exceptional in the meals that they serve, the solace that they provide, and the different things that they do before, during, and after disasters. But what I want to talk about today is the partnership opportunities that still exist. Now, many of you know that there are more than 300,000 religious congregations across the United States, representing all faiths, and you have a plethora of organizations that represent no faith, but provide invaluable needs. But where the opportunity lies is with the contribution of more than $1.2 trillion from American religion to American society annually. I believe we need more emergency managers to act from and engage in a place of unashamed faith when it comes to building partnerships with faith-based and community-based organizations. And that's not just limited to the congregations. I'm talking about institutions of higher education, I'm talking about businesses, and those storefront and large houses of worship as well. And I learned my lessons from a few emergency managers and faith leaders throughout my career journey. I learned the value of humility and transparency from Reverend Dr. Gabriel Salguero and his wife, Reverend Salguero, who in Orlando during 2017 partnered with city manager Manny Soto. You see, Manny is a man who has long been about humility and transparency as an emergency manager, opening his doors and providing outreach and training, but he's also a man that's humble enough to know when he can't meet the gap alone. You had thousands of families from the islands of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands coming into the city of Orlando, landing in the airport, and then going into the multi-agency resource center in the airport. It's a lot of information, and for a family that's going through a disaster, it can be a very troubling time. But when they got off the plane, the first people they engaged with was a member of the faith community. And some of those members came from Calvario City Church. Now that's an example of humility and transparency, both on the side of emergency managers that are looking to engage and fill the gaps, but then also those faith leaders who recognize and understand that there's a larger system at play that they need to fit into. My second lesson comes from Sherry Capers from Miami-Dade County Office of Emergency Management. I've worked with Sherry a long time. She was one of the first emergency managers I met in the field, and one of the things that she was committed to as an emergency planner and still is committed to this day is taking the opposing models of emergency management and the faith community and working through those tensions to create new opportunities and new outcomes that are mutually beneficial to both sectors. This is related to a concept introduced by Roger Martin called integrative thinking. Now, in the emergency management world, you had a whole host of other emergency managers and faith leaders taking a similar approach, and in partnership with FEMA, IAEM, and a whole host of organizations, developed a 7-step engagement process that's easily accessible and publicly available to all emergency managers. The third lesson came from a gentleman in Washington, Illinois, Pastor Ben Davison, who was shepherding his flock at 8 a.m., getting prepared for 11 a.m. when they got a tornado warning. And this is in between services. And so after everyone was safe, thankfully his church wasn't impacted, but the entire community was rocked. So in working with the Washington Ministerial Alliance, members of the Illinois Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, and others, instead of looking at the deficits and things that they lost, he began to look at the assets that they can bring to bear. And in understanding the needs of the community, he said, well, I have a warehouse, I have willing volunteers, so maybe we can bring to bear a donations and volunteer reception center. And lastly, fellowship. So many of you may be familiar with the IAEM Faith-Based Caucus, and I know many of you work alongside members of the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. And what we're doing here today and what they do every year is engage in various forms of fellowship. Now, fellowship is important because with that commitment to communication, collaboration, coordination, and cooperation, you begin to build those things that we're talking about in emergency management. Building more social capital, strengthening ties of social cohesion, and making sure that we exchange business cards long before we need to at the site of a disaster. So when we think about humility, transparency, integrative thinking, appreciative inquiry, and fellowship, we see that we have the building blocks to continue to expand our engagement with the faith community. But I encourage emergency managers from across the country to be continuous and dogmatic about your engagement with local faith-based and community-based organizations by engaging in fellowship through your exercises and different emergency planning activities. By taking a process of appreciative inquiry when it comes to looking at the assets that those faith-based and community organizations bring to bear. By being committed to integrative thinking and understanding that there may be some opposition between the models, but ultimately you can create outcomes that benefit both parties. Maintaining a posture of transparency and making sure that you can be truthful about where you can meet the gaps and honest about where the gaps still remain. And most importantly, humility. Being humble in your leadership and humble in your engagement and understanding of those faith leaders. And I believe if you do these things, we can make sure that you keep the faith when you're it. Thank you.